The dust motes danced in the unforgiving shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy window of the assay office, illuminating the heavy silence that had fallen like a shroud. Ilara, her Apache blood a dark counterpoint to the pale, fearful faces of the townsfolk, felt the weight of their stares, each one a stone added to the burden she carried. Her grandmother's silver bracelet, cool against her wrist, felt like a tether to a past that was rapidly eroding, a world consumed by the relentless westward march of men who saw only wilderness where she saw home. She was marked, not by ink or brand, but by the whispers that followed her like a hungry shadow, by the glares that stripped her bare in the town square, by the chilling certainty that her presence was an affront, an anomaly to be eradicated. This was not a place of belonging for her, but a crucible where identities were forged in fire or extinguished by the chilling indifference of a society bent on its own rigid order. The air itself seemed to crackle with an unspoken verdict, a premonition of violence that hummed beneath the surface of the dusty street. She knew the mark was death, a slow, inevitable creeping in, or a sudden, brutal declaration. Her very existence challenged their fragile peace, their stolen prosperity, their convenient narratives. Every creak of a floorboard, every distant whinny of a horse seemed to carry the echo of her impending doom. She had come to sell what little she had, not to beg, but to reclaim a piece of what was hers, a small act of defiance in a landscape of submission. The tension was a living thing, coiling around her, tightening with every breath she took. This was the quiet before the storm, the held breath before the plunge, a moment suspended between what was and what was about to be irrevocably broken. The silver bracelet, a silent testament to generations, felt suddenly heavy, a promise made by a dying world. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The rancher, Elias Thorne, stood by the corral fence, his gaze sweeping across the vast sun-baked land, a solitary figure etched against the relentless blue sky. His boots were scuffed, his hat weathered, and his eyes, though tired, held a sharp, observant glint. He had seen Ilara in town, a flicker of defiance in her dark eyes that resonated with something deep within him, a refusal to break that he understood, even admired. Years ago, a chance encounter had etched her face into his memory, a memory of a time when the boundaries were less defined, when the land still held its secrets, and people, though wary, moved with a different kind of respect for the vastness around them. He remembered a drought-stricken summer, a broken fence, and a young Ilara, barely more than a girl, her hands surprisingly strong as she helped him pull a struggling calf from a muddy ditch. No words were exchanged, only shared effort, a silent pact forged in the heat of a crisis. That moment, brief and unremarked, had left a faint but indelible mark on his soul, a sense of shared humanity that transcended the hardening lines of race and tribe that were now being drawn with such brutal certainty. He was a man of the earth, weathered by its caprices, accustomed to solitude and the stark realities of survival. He had built his life stone by stone, fence post by fence post, a solitary empire of dust and will. Yet the memory of her, small and fierce against the elements, had always remained, a quiet challenge to the prevailing prejudices he saw festering around him. He wasn't a hero, never claimed to be. He was a man with his own devils, his own dark corners, but he knew injustice when he saw it, felt it like a rock in his gut, and he saw it now, raw and undisguised, closing in on her. The land had taught him patience, but it had also taught him when to act, when the tide was turning against the vulnerable. The whispers had metastasized, growing louder, bolder, now carrying the weight of open threat. The townsfolk, a collective entity of fear and resentment, moved in a subtle yet coordinated dance of exclusion. Children stopped their games as Ilara passed, pulling closer to their mother's skirts. Shopkeepers turned their backs, feigning busy work, their silence a sharper sting than any open insult. The air thickened with unspoken accusations, with the pervasive sense that she was an unwanted stain on their meticulously crafted tapestry of order. The lawman, Sheriff Brody, a man whose uniform barely concealed the rot beneath, embodied this escalating menace. His eyes, cold and assessing, followed Ilara with a predatory slowness, his hand resting conspicuously on the butt of his pistol. He represented the grim efficiency of a society determined to purge what it deemed impure. His pronouncements were not direct threats, but chillingly veiled warnings, delivered with a detached professionalism that made them all the more terrifying. He spoke of upholding the peace, of maintaining order, words that, in this context, were thinly disguised euphemisms for forced compliance and brutal subjugation. The general store owner, a portly man named Silas who usually prided himself on his neutrality, now openly sneered, his gaze lingering on the worn soles of Ilara's boots, a silent judgment of her poverty, her otherness. Every doorway became a barrier, every face a wall. Ilara walked through a gauntlet of hostility, a living target in a town that had decided her fate. The sun, once a source of warmth, now felt like a spotlight, intensifying the scrutiny, burning away any last vestige of anonymity. This was not a gradual descent into hostility. It was a precipitous fall, hastened by unseen forces, driven by the collective will of a community determined to see her broken or gone. The threat had moved beyond whispers. It was a tangible presence, a shadow falling across her path. Elias Thorne stood on the edge of the escalating storm, a witness to the cruelty that simmered and then boiled over in the town. His ranch, isolated and quiet, offered a fragile sanctuary, but the town's poisoned air seeped even there. He saw the shift in Sheriff Brody's posture, the way the man now openly observed Ilara, not just as a potential nuisance, but as a problem to be solved with the swift, brutal efficiency of a coiled snake. Elias felt the familiar ache of indecision, a tug-of-war between the quiet life he had painstakingly built and the raw, undeniable injustice unfolding before his eyes. He had made choices in his past that left their own bitter taste, moments of cowardice or calculated indifference that he now wore like scars. He was no stranger to moral gray areas. His hands, though calloused by honest labor, had not always been clean. He remembered the desperate choices of his youth, the lines he had crossed to survive, the compromises that had shaped him into this hardened, solitary figure. His heart, long insulated against the world's pain, now throbbed with an unfamiliar rhythm, a mixture of anger and a reluctant empathy. What claim did he have to righteousness? What right did he possess to intervene in a world that had always devoured the weak? Yet, the image of Ilara, small and defiant, her eyes holding the strength of generations, gnawed at him. He saw in her a reflection of the untamed spirit of the land he loved, a spirit that these men sought to crush. He could turn away, retreat to the safety of his ranch, let the inevitable unfold. It would be easier, certainly. But the thought left a metallic taste in his mouth, the bitter tang of regret already forming. The choice was not between good and evil, but between complicity and a costly, perhaps futile stand. The silence of his own conscience was louder than any shouts from the town. The rancher, Elias, did not make a grand pronouncement or stride dramatically into the fray. His intervention began with a single, deliberate act. He stood openly in Ilara's path as she walked past the mercantile, offering a silent barrier between her and the hostile gazes. It was a gesture so subtle, so deceptively simple, yet it carried the weight of defiance. He didn't speak to her, didn't acknowledge the townsfolk, but his presence, unyielding and still, created a ripple of discomfort. Sheriff Brody, observing from the saloon's porch, stiffened, his eyes narrowing. This was not a challenge to authority, not yet, but a silent declaration of alignment, a statement that Elias Thorne was not, and would not be, a passive bystander. The store owner, Silas, cleared his throat, suddenly finding his ledger more interesting than the scene outside. Elias's very presence, his reputation as a man who lived by his own code, carried an unspoken authority. He wasn't a man to be trifled with, and his sudden quiet stand sent a clear message. The woman was not as alone as they had imagined. This small act of solidarity was a spark in the tinderbox, and the air hummed with the potential for explosion. Ilara, surprised by his silent maneuver, met his gaze for a fleeting moment, a spark of recognition passing between them, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of their isolated lives. It was not gratitude she felt, but a complex mix of surprise and a wary acknowledgement of a new, dangerous variable. The lines had been drawn, and Elias Thorne, a man who had always prided himself on his neutrality, had just stepped firmly onto the side of the marked. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken threats, a moment of profound tension where the shifting balance of power was almost palpable. Years prior, a bitter winter had descended upon the territory, unforgiving and relentless, burying the land under a shroud of ice and snow. Elias had been out checking his distant traps, a lonely endeavor, when he stumbled upon a makeshift shelter, barely more than a lean-to, a wisp of smoke struggling from its opening. Inside, huddled against the biting cold, was a small band of Apache, among them Alara, then a child, shivering uncontrollably, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fever. Her mother, too weak to move, had been tending to her, her face etched with despair. Elias, hardened by the brutal realities of the frontier, had a choice: ride on, ignore the plight of those society had deemed other, or offer a hand. The memory of his own family, lost to an unforgiving epidemic years earlier, a wound that still festered, had pricked his conscience. He had shared his meager supplies, dried meat, a precious flask of whiskey for medicinal purposes, and without a word had helped them reinforce their shelter, cutting logs, sharing the grueling labor. It was a brief alliance born of desperation, a silent recognition of shared humanity against the indifferent might of nature. Ilara's mother, before they vanished with the spring thaw, had given him a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a token of silent gratitude. Elias had kept it, a secret reminder that there were moments when the lines blurred, when the shared struggle for survival transcended the arbitrary divisions of men. This was not charity, but a simple act of reciprocal survival, a moment that had quietly reshaped his own understanding of the world. It was a memory he rarely revisited, a fragile shard of warmth in his otherwise solitary existence, but it was the silent anchor that now pulled him towards action, a quiet echo of a past he had almost forgotten. The silence that had followed Elias's subtle intervention shattered with the abrupt appearance of Brody's men, not the town's official deputies, but a rough, unofficial posse of ranch hands and disgruntled settlers, their faces grim, their hands resting ominously on their rifle stocks. They moved with a practiced efficiency, fanning out, encircling Alara and, by extension, Elias. The air crackled with a new, more immediate kind of tension, the polite veneer of societal order stripped away to reveal the raw, predatory instinct beneath. "Thorn," Brody's voice cut through the stillness, cold and sharp. "You're interfering with justice. This woman has caused trouble and she needs to be dealt with Apache style." The implied threat hung heavy, a noose tightening around Alara. Brody's eyes, fixed on Elias, held a challenge, a dare to oppose him. Elias, standing firm, his posture unyielding, felt the weight of their combined animosity, a palpable force pushing against him. He saw the glint of malice in the eyes of Silas, the store owner who had joined the posse, his face flushed with self-righteous fury. "She's a menace," Silas spat, his voice laced with the poison of his prejudices. "A threat to our peace." The collective murmur of the townsfolk, once whispers now solidified into an angry hum, an encouragement to the armed men. Alara, her face stoic, felt the trap closing, a cold dread seeping into her bones. Her grandmother's bracelet felt like a brand now, not a comfort. She glanced at Elias, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. He was alone, outnumbered, facing down not just Brody, but the entrenched fear and hatred of an entire community. The moment was not just about Alara's fate. It was about the very soul of the town, about whether fear or a flicker of desperate courage would prevail. The noose was tightening, and the confrontation had begun in earnest. The climax arrived not with a thunderous roar, but with a sharp, sickening thud. Brody, his patience worn thin, made his move, lunging towards Alara, his intent clear, his hand reaching for her arm with brutal force. But Elias, anticipating the move, was faster. With a fluidity born of countless brawls and a lifetime of hard labor, he intercepted Brody, not with a fist, but with a sudden, unexpected shoulder tackle that sent the lawman stumbling back, winded, his hat flying. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath. The other men in Brody's posse, momentarily stunned by the audacity of Elias's move, hesitated, their weapons still at their sides, uncertain how to react to this direct physical challenge to their leader. Elias did not look at them. His eyes were fixed on Brody, a silent challenge in their depths, a stark contrast to the lawman's spluttering rage. "This ends now, Brody." Elias's voice was low, raw, stripped of pretense. "Or it ends with more blood than you're prepared for." It was not a plea, but a threat, a desperate gamble. The air was thick with the scent of dust and fear, the rapid beating of hearts. Ilara, momentarily protected, felt the tremor of adrenaline, the cold reality of how close she had come to the brink. She saw the rage contorting Brody's face, the flash of a Bowie knife in his hand as he recovered, lunging again, no longer concerned with arrests, only with retribution. This was the moment, the turning point, raw and brutal, where the veneer of law and order dissolved into primal struggle. Elias met the attack head-on, not dodging, but moving into it, a desperate final act of defiance. The fate of Ilara and perhaps a small piece of justice hung suspended in that brutal, silent exchange of blows. The impact reverberated through the street, a stark punctuation mark on the town's simmering hatred. The dust settled slowly, coating everything in a fine, gritty layer, a symbolic shroud over the brutal exchange. Brody lay groaning, his knife skittering uselessly in the dirt, a deep gash bleeding freely from his arm where Elias's desperate counter had found its mark. Elias stood over him, breathing heavily, a bruise already blossoming on his temple, his knuckles raw and bleeding. The other men in Brody's posse, momentarily disarmed by the sudden, decisive violence, looked at each other, then at the defeated lawman, their bravado evaporating in the face of Elias's unexpected ferocity. The collective anger of the townsfolk had deflated, replaced by a stunned, uncomfortable silence. This was not the neat clinical justice they had anticipated. This was raw, messy, and unexpected. Silas, the store owner, visibly recoiled, his face pale. The consequences, immediate and stark, hung heavy in the air. Elias had won the fight, but what had he truly gained? He had alienated the town, invited future retribution, and now stood exposed, a solitary figure who had dared to defy the prevailing tide. Ilara, her gaze fixed on Elias, saw not a hero but a man profoundly tired, yet unyielding. Her own heart, battered by fear and a lifetime of struggle, felt a strange, fragile easing. The mark had not been erased, but its immediate execution had been postponed, perhaps even averted. She knew the fight was far from over, that the scars of this day would run deep for both of them. The tension, though no longer at its peak, still thrummed, a low, ominous hum beneath the surface of the quiet street. They were safe for now, but the path ahead was uncertain, fraught with unseen dangers, and forever changed by this singular act of desperate courage. The days that followed were steeped in a strange, uneasy quiet. Brody, his arm bandaged, stalked the town with a simmering resentment, his authority diminished, his reputation scarred. The townsfolk, though still wary of Ilara, now also regarded Elias with a new, complex mix of fear and grudging respect. He had broken their unspoken rules, shattered their easy assumptions, and in doing so, had become an outsider himself, a man who stood not just for Ilara, but against the very fabric of their carefully constructed prejudice. Elias returned to his ranch, the solitude now carrying a heavier weight. He was no longer just a solitary rancher. He was the man who had stood alone against the tide. He carried the physical aches of the fight, but also a deeper exhaustion, the toll of confronting not just a man, but an entire way of thinking. He found himself replaying the moments, the cold glint of Brody's eye, the sudden rush of adrenaline, the quiet defiance in Ilara's gaze. There was no triumph, only a grim satisfaction in having acted, in having pushed back against the encroaching darkness. Ilara, too, felt the lingering echoes of the confrontation. The town was still hostile, but the raw edge had dulled, replaced by a hesitant, watchful silence. She knew she could not stay, not truly, but Elias's intervention had bought her time, a precious commodity. She reflected on his unexpected courage, a man who had risked everything for a stranger, for an idea of justice that transcended the brutal realities of the frontier. It was a fragile seed of hope, planted in the scorched earth of despair, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest corners, a glimmer of light could still break through, even if only for a fleeting moment. Their paths, once separate, had now irrevocably intertwined. The vast, indifferent land stretched out, silent witness to the ebb and flow of human cruelties and small, unexpected acts of grace. Elias Thorne continued his solitary life on the ranch, forever marked by the day he chose to stand, not with his own kind, but with a woman deemed an outsider. The town still regarded him with suspicion, a man who had shown them a reflection of their own ugliness. But occasionally, a child less steeped in prejudice would look at him with a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even admiration. The fight had not changed the world, not truly, but it had carved out a small, quiet space where courage had defied cowardice, where a single, flawed man had chosen dignity over convenience. Ilara, though she did not remain in the town, carried the memory of Elias's stand, a profound and complex truth etched into her spirit. She moved on, a ghost of her past, seeking a new horizon, but the echo of his defiance resonated within her, a quiet strength. The scar on Brody's arm was a constant, visible reminder of his defeat, a symbol of the fragile nature of his authority. The incident became a whispered legend, a tale told with varying degrees of resentment or reluctant awe, a testament to the moment when the established order had been challenged and, for a brief, shattering instant, broken. The land remained, vast and unforgiving, a canvas for human stories, both tragic and enduring. And in the heart of that rugged landscape, the memory of a white rancher who stood alone for a black Apache woman lingered, a testament to the enduring, complex nature of the human spirit, and the quiet, often unacknowledged battles fought not with armies, but with the simple, dangerous choice to be human. The hope was not in a perfect ending, but in the enduring possibility of such a choice.